and the vagus nerve. I think a very interesting subject, and we'll be sharing some great stories. Okay, cool. So we're live on YouTube. Welcome, everybody. It's going to be a trauma vagus nerve video again. So we're going to deep dive into it. We've gotten some elucidation on what trauma release is that we've asked about over the last week or so. So we're going to share some of that stuff. But before we get started, the first thing we're going to do is the simultaneous squeeze. So many of you who watch know what that is. And what we're going to be doing is taking a big deep breath in all the way, filling our lungs all the way up, holding that air in. And then we're going to try and squeeze that air inside of our body while keeping our mouth and our lips closed. You're going to squeeze your stomach, squeeze your diaphragm, squeeze your chest, and push that energy kind of up, that air up into your head, into your face. And we're going to try to induce a vasovagal type of response. Don't do this while driving. Don't do this while walking or operating heavy machinery. So it may make you actually feel really dizzy, but a good kind of dizzy. And then we're not going to do the breathing stuff before. We're just going to take that big deep breath in. Okay. So enough explaining. Let's do this. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Breathe in. And then take a sip of air at the top. Hold it. Squeeze it. And release. Slowly. Just like that. Nice. Okay, good. Wow. What a rush. What a good feeling. How did you guys feel? Was that like a moment, like after you take your a nice big sip of coffee? It's got that same that refreshing feeling. But this is like the end of the day cup of coffee, which I love. I so love that. So anyway, so the subject of today is on trauma. Now, last week I posed the question to my Facebook friends, and I asked them to explain to me, what is releasing trauma? What does it mean to release trauma? Because I've heard a lot of conflicting reports about what it is to release trauma, and there's no one consistent story to what it means to release trauma. And also, there's also an assumption that's made in that field that we look at trauma as something that should be or can be or is releasable. So by saying, well, of course you need to release trauma, there's this concept in mass persuasion. So in mind control, mass persuasion studies, when they look at like, how does the media control the thoughts of the people? This is called mass persuasion. There's a concept called thinking past the sale. So thinking past the sale would be like if you went to a car dealership and instead of the car dealer, the sales guy asking you, well, so do you want a car or do you not want a car? Because that's not assuming that you are going to buy the car. And that's not a good play. What you'll often find the best sales guys at a car lot are going to ask you are, well, do you want the red car or do you want the blue car? Which assumes the sale. It assumes that you're already going to buy a car. Now it's just getting down to the little details of, I want red. Oh, maybe blue. But you're not thinking of the should I or shouldn't I. So there's something within the term releasing trauma that is a thinking past the sale pattern as well, which is the fact that you're considering releasing trauma, which assumes that trauma is something that can be released. Or is it? And that's the question that I have. I do believe that trauma is obviously a real thing. There's obviously a real thing called trauma. You can be traumatized if you're in a war zone and a big explosion goes off. In middle school, my social studies teacher fought in the Vietnam War, and if there was ever a loud bang, like if some kid dropped their textbooks on the ground, this guy would hit the floor and get into a fighting position, because in Vietnam, in the jungles of Vietnam, he was very traumatized by loud explosions happening all the time, and that was just an innate response. I would certainly consider that to be a form of psychological trauma. He was traumatized by that. He had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that was just how it is. Also, the teachers always noticed that this teacher in particular would never sit with his back to the door in or out of the room. He would always get the seat that looked directly at the door. This guy was very paranoid, but he was a great teacher. He was a really good teacher. He just developed some innate coping strategies for trauma that happened to him. Now, the question is, in the case of, let's say, a psychological trauma, if you've ever heard of elephants, I think everybody's heard by now that elephants have essentially an infinite memory. So elephants in the wild, in the safari, do not forget a face. They do not forget a person. They don't forget anything about their entire life. Apparently, elephants can have a lifespan of memory. So if they saw you once when they were a little baby, little elephant, if they see you 40 years later, they'll recognize you. So elephants have an extremely good memory. Now, elephants, we know, are the subject of the tusk trade. So elephants are tranquilized in the wild, their tusks are cut right off and taken. And this is a traumatic experience. Oftentimes they're left for dead. Again, the poachers do not care about the health of the elephant because these tusks are not going to grow back. So it's kind of a one-time thank you, goodbye kind of deal, because those tusks go for a lot of money on the market. So an elephant, which we know has perfect memory, can't forget things. So if trauma is a memory, then how would an elephant forget a trauma? So that starts to lead into us being a little bit doubtful of this idea of psychological trauma. If it gets released, would that mean that you forget the trauma that happened? Well, probably no. It's likely that the answer to that is no. And even in a human, there are some human beings that do also have rather picture-perfect memories, where if you ask them to recall an instance from their past, they could, with photographic perfect recall, remember what happened. And there's a difference between remembering what happened and remembering that it was traumatizing. So you could theoretically replay in your brain, like if you did a therapy called like EMDR, which is eye movement rapid EMDR, desensitization rapid eye movement. So it's basically a therapy where you replay a traumatic experience. I've actually done EMDR. There's a car accident that happened to me back when I was in college, and I did some EMDR for that, and it helped me to remember the event, but to see myself as floating 30 feet above it. So I could remember it, but I didn't have any of that visceral emotional reaction to it. Now, I could still tell you exactly what happened in that instance, but because I've remembered it differently, I re-encoded that memory in a different way, it no longer has an effect on me. At that point in time, I would have been afraid to get behind the wheel of a car in that first couple of weeks because it was pretty terrifying. What happened? Some guy, it was a road rage incident, and this guy came and tried to rip me out of my car right near Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in the campus. And it was pretty terrifying. And actually 6 months later, I saw that same man entering into the karaoke bar downtown Berkeley that I was at. And I was super triggered by the entire experience of seeing him again. And my plan was that I was going to go back in there and start a fight with the guy. Now, naturally, this guy probably was crazy, probably could have killed me. But the bouncer of that bar recognized my physiology was in a heightened state of awareness. And he sniffed me out like just immediately. He just put his hand on my chest. He said, "No, man, you're not going in there. Like, you need to calm down." He didn't even know the whole situation. It was just a bouncer. But my physiology was so worked up that I was so ready to go in there, and I was just gonna because this guy, ruined an entire year of my college career. It was such a horrific experience to have that happen, where your life was flashing before your eyes. It's like a 47-year-old man, buff dude with tattoos all over his neck, trying to rip you out of your car, saying, "I'm gonna kill you, man." And I only flipped the guy off. I didn't do anything that bad, but that happened. So that was a traumatic experience. And so I did EMDR therapy to kind of re-encode that psychologically. And I think to a degree it did help. It did help. But it helped until many months later that I saw the guy again and I recognized him. And he was at the same place that I frequented, right? So a place that I felt was the safest space for me to be at night in Berkeley, California, was at the Down Low karaoke bar. And I would sing karaoke. We made friends like with just everybody. We had locals that were there every week. It was very fun. And I love singing. So it was a great time for me. But then to see this face reemerge in my place, the place that I enjoy, was extremely triggering, immediately triggering. And I'm really fortunate that bouncer was able to recognize a state of high sympathetic stress in my person, and he stopped me from going into that bar. Now, I don't think I would have actually done anything, but in that moment, I was like, I wanted revenge. I just wanted, I don't know, to give him a piece of my mind or whatever. Some very male chauvinist kind of way of thinking. But no doubt about it, the guy probably would have killed me right there in the bar and thought nothing of it. So the bouncer saved my life probably. So now here's the thing. I can tell you that story now, and I'm not traumatized by it. I don't have a visceral reaction to what happened. Thank God. And not like I did then. But there's nothing about that experience that I like released in any way. I still have the full picture perfect memory of it. If I saw that person again walking down the street, I wouldn't have nearly a reaction. This is many, many years ago, 15 plus years ago at this point in time, if not more. Yeah, something like that. Quite a long time ago. So I have no visceral reaction to that. So time has healed a lot of things. But in its place, in that memory's place, I've developed new memories and done a lot of work on affirmations and building success and working towards a greater purpose in my own life. And so I don't really have room for that kind of reaction to things anymore, right? So I've re-encoded in my brain some affirmations that tell me that it's more important to create than to destroy. And I've created a standard in my life, in my thinking, in my very being. And I've said it to myself for years and years and years as part of my daily affirmations is I will create, not destroy. I am a force for good. I'm a leader, and I will defy the odds. So I've created a mental neurological pathway in my brain that doesn't allow me to get triggered by that instance any longer, nor other experiences in my life too that have been very traumatic. Not to mention the physical damage that happened alongside of that accident was also very traumatic to my neck, which is why I'm such a big advocate for getting people to gain awareness of their neck health, especially after a whiplash, because your neck health determines your vagus nerve health. And if you have, this is why a car accident or a physical injury combined with a psychological trauma can be so long lasting. And that's the purpose of today's talk, which is, can you release trauma if your vagus nerve hasn't recovered yet? And my answer is absolutely not. You're not even going to be able to start on accessing trauma if your vagus nerve is shot. If it's hurt, if it's not working, if something damaged your vagus nerve and you haven't done any work to fix that issue underlying, then the process by which whatever happens to that trauma, either if you crowd it out, right? Could you crowd out trauma by reinforcing strong belief systems in your own heart and mind and body and soul. I believe you can. That's my core conviction, is that rather than being so universally focused on yanking out the weeds of trauma, because there could be lots of them, right? Because what counts as a trauma? Once you've dealt with the big stuff, then do you deal with the, well, I felt slighted by this one guy one time and he looked at me cross, so I felt like I was traumatized from that, and so I got to deal with that trauma too. It's like you can't really go through life thinking like that. You kind of got to, honestly, I would say my best advice is to try to laugh about it and then move on, if anything. That's kind of the pathway to do this. And how am I able to say things like this? Like, you look at me and you go, well, what would you know, Sterling, this person, this beautiful young man on my computer screen or my phone? What would you know about any of this stuff? And what I would tell you is that certainly my own life history has had some pretty extraordinary traumatic experiences. I would say that the trauma that I experienced when I was 4 years old was so severe in my family that I essentially blacked out for an entire year from the age of 4 to 5. I couldn't tell you what happened in that ensuing time. And every, therapist and everybody who looked at me was like, you were kind of a non-responsive kid. You became very internally focused and very closed off from people. So it had an effect on me, and I had to find my way back to being a human. And I think the outlet that I took was becoming a class clown and actually trying to focus on making people laugh in class, even though the teacher didn't like it. So I really became a thorn in the side of my teachers in that time, in those years from 7, 8, 9, and 10, and 11, and 12, up until my teens, when I immediately reverted back to shy again through the first part of high school. So my brain made some big clicks and shifts all of a sudden throughout the years. So it's difficult to assume that there was a release of trauma or anything like that. There were simply natural progressions and shifts in my thinking, in my beliefs, in my inputs, in my friend circle, removing certain types of people from my life, being more connected to other better influences in my life, etc. So that's certainly my own childhood personal story in terms of some aspects of trauma. Not even nearly an exhaustive list of what has happened, but in my adult life, dealing with people with trauma, that is where I believe I have some ability to speak to this subject. In that, the primary aspect of my work with other human beings is strictly in the stimulation of their vagus nerve for the purposes of increasing overall vagal tone and measuring that through obvious, observable, clinically valid measurements, as well as subjective self-reports. There are lots of ways to determine the health or unhealth of a vagus nerve. And I've posted the links to some stuff before. I'll do it again. I'll put this here. vegushub.com/symptoms. You can check that out later if you want, but you can just remember that webpage. There are some great details on there to understand what are the symptoms of vagus nerve damage. Do you have some symptoms? Does somebody that you know have some of those same symptoms? And if those symptoms relieve after stimulating the vagus nerve, then we can categorically say that the vagus nerve now is functioning more in line with how it should be. So that is kind of the work that I've been doing for quite a few years. I'd say close to 6 years of work, with no breaks in between. This has been my full-time 100% work, is working with people to heal and repair their vagus nerve through a number of different sequential interventions, primarily through one, stimulating their vagus nerve, secondarily through repairing their nervous system health through supplementation and exercise and diet and mindset, as well as in the exercise, our focus is honestly on the neck and posture and core muscles in the psoas area, my exercise work is going to focus on the neck, posture, and your psoas chain, this whole chain that goes through. I'm not necessarily trying to get people big biceps, but I do. That's a nice byproduct of the work we do, which is cool. But we see people standing up straight. They have good posture. Their necks look really good. And they have corollary release of some of these traumatic responses to life that they typically had before. So some very, very fascinating things I have observed in these many years that I've been doing vagus nerve stimulation with real human beings and people that have clear-cut childhood trauma, severe trauma, complex PTSD, the whole gamut, right? So I have real hands-on, real experience in helping people go from point A to point B in resolving the symptoms, I believe, of their trauma having not been addressed for many, many years. I was speaking with a client, and she was telling me that since she's been in our phase 1 program and now in phase 2, she's seeing some substantial shifts in her health across the board. Better energy, more mental energy, more physical energy. She's also absorbing food and nutrients way better. She used to be dependent on magnesium. Now she doesn't have to take magnesium to go to the bathroom anymore. So she's literally absorbing nutrients in her body. And all we've been doing is stimulating the vagus nerve. Nothing radically different. You know, when we talk about supplements, people go, oh, here we go. It's going to be $2,000 worth of supplements. No, it's not that much at all. It's not even close. It's a few key supplements, usually between like probably $50, $100 tops. Just a few key ones that we use to support your vagus nerve through the process. So nothing crazy radical. I'd say the crazy radical thing is how I specifically stimulate the vagus nerve, which is way different than anybody else that I think is doing this in the world right now. There's only like a very small elite handful of people who know how to stimulate the vagus nerve in the way that I do. And so this client that I spoke with today, she wanted to bring this subject up with me, and I thought, it's a good subject of conversation. I think it's relevant. And I was sharing with her as well a client from back in 2019 who came to me with reports of gastroparesis, depression, like inflammatory conditions that you can just not even imagine. Just pain, fibromyalgia, joint pain, dizziness, head spinning, just you name it. Like everything that you could imagine to go wrong at the age of 54 at that time. It wasn't good. And you could see it in her face. She was just wearing the weight of the world in her person. One thing that she did, which was really fascinating, was typically back then, this is back in early 2019 when I had this client. Our primary protocol was typically stimulating the vagus nerve on the neck. So right here on the neck. And she had severe gastroparesis for probably about 10 years. So for 10 years, she had to do anything and everything possible just to be able to go to the bathroom. So she was doing coffee enemas. By this point in the time that we met, she was having to do coffee enemas once or 2 or 3 times per day just to be able to go to the bathroom. So she'd been through a lot, for sure. But she didn't know why she was so sick. They assumed like maybe you have MS, maybe you have some kind of a early neurodegenerative disorder, but they couldn't really diagnose her with anything. And she said, a lot of the doctors here don't get what this is, so they can't help me. And that's why someone from Norway sought me out all the way in California to go to work with her and to help her out. And it was the funny thing is like, I got to give her a lot of credit because she, in the course that we teach, we talk a lot about where the vagus nerve goes and what parts of the vagus nerve control what functions. Naturally, we would have spoken about the vagus nerve's connection to your intestines and your colon, thus a very important blocking place if you have something like gastroparesis. So she took it upon herself one night. Must have been 2 or 3 weeks into the protocol, very early on. And, she didn't ask my permission. She didn't ask me if she could do it or if she should, but she actually took the stimulator and she stimulated her sacrum, which is on the back part above the tailbone. So she went there and did the stimulation right there on her sacrum. And not within more than 10-15 minutes from that stimulation on a high setting, did she start to feel her whole body start to get warm, that her skin started to perspire, that her body started to kind of stretch, like she felt like she had a stretch that she had to get. And then that turned into like undulations in her entire body that she couldn't necessarily control. And then her legs started kind of fluttering like a butterfly. This was her psoas muscle actually having a minor contraction, sort of similar, something you'd see similar to an orgasm, actually. So something akin to that. But she had no idea what was going on. And she didn't do anything that would have induced a orgasmic state. But her body had this 45-minute experience that was just all over the place. She had the flash of emotions, she had the sweating, she had the movement, the shaking, the undulations. She was just very confused as to what was actually happening. And so she messaged me the next day, and she had time to process it. But what came back to her was the core trauma of her adulthood was what happened to her when she was a child, where she was, trigger warning, I guess, but, she was sexually assaulted by some older men in her community, in her small town in this part of Europe. And it was brutal. And it was left a lasting impact on her. And this is one of a series of many traumas that she would endure growing up. Very, very many bad things, including, family members, alcoholism, suicide, attempts at suicide, completion of suicide, taking care of a paralyzed husband who hated her, all kinds of awful things. Very, very, very bad life. So when she got to me, she was at 54 years old, full on gastroparesis. Like I said, her whole face you could just see. And I don't say this to, I don't want you to like, wow, Sterling, he's like so judgmental. Well, I'm saying that because if you look at her face now, she looks like she lost 20 years. Her skin has literally tightened back up. Like she looks 20 years younger. That's why I bring that specific feature up, is because of how much she looks like she de-aged from doing that work. So she had an experience from stimulating her vagus nerve successfully. And guess what? Her primary health concern of gastroparesis completely gone. She doesn't have to do coffee enemas. She doesn't have to do 3 hours of red light on her belly every day like she used to. She's completely moved on from that chapter of her life, that decade-long chapter of what could only be described as a living nightmare, a daily waking nightmare. And a big factor for that was stimulating her vagus nerve, was for a time in her health journey, was to say, you know what? This nerve is important. I'm going to do something with this nerve, this vagus nerve that I have, and see what happens. And that's what she did. And I'm actually very grateful for her. We're all in the program very grateful for her being a pioneer in stimulating the sacral branch of her vagus nerve to discover the impact that vagus nerve stimulation can have in more than just one part of your body. It doesn't just have to be on the neck. It can be on the spleen for anti-inflammation. It can be on the pancreas for digestive enzymes. It could be on the top of the stomach for your colon. It could be on the sacrum. It could be on the bladder. There's lots of different parts where the vagus nerve goes. We've even started to experiment with the right here on the chest, on the breastplate, to hit the heart. And I can tell you right now that experience, that feeling, is like warmth, love, everything that you would expect what would happen when your heart opens up. Those feelings can happen. And that's from stimulating the heart, the vagus nerve branch that goes to your heart. It's absolutely insane. It's so cool. It's so beautiful that that's possible. But yeah, so anyway, just to belay the skeptics out there who are like, what would this guy know? Of course, how would he know about all this stuff with trauma? Since that client, I've had now close to, I think, 600 people go through the same type of work. And we've always seen very profound shifts in their relationship to traumatic experiences in the past. Now, that's not to say that that she forgot anything. If you asked her, she could tell you down to the exact narrow detail what happened. It was almost as if it was remembering trauma that allowed her to move through it. And she the first thing she said to me is she said, I've never told anybody this. I completely forgot that any of that happened. But in the remembering it, in the refinding of some core memory, was the therapeutic aspect of it. But it all happened because she was stimulating her vagus nerve. Without her vagus nerve being healthy, that event most likely would not have happened. And it's not to say that only with me, that's the only way she could have ever had some kind of release like that, or that she could have had a profound transformative experience. I'm not saying that. There could be multiple paths to get there. But I believe what you'll find is that the core feature behind what a successful, you can paint it in lots of ways. You can paint this as, well, clearly, Sterling, she released her trauma. You told us yourself. She was sweating. She was probably sweating out the neurotransmitters of trauma, which I don't believe that that's what was happening, that you're sweating out. You don't sweat out trauma. But I've literally had that told to me, that there's chemicals of trauma, like the chemicals themselves. I'm like, well, could you give me, what's the scientific name for this trauma chemical? It's not cortisol. It's not adrenaline. Those aren't trauma chemicals. Those can happen in a completely normal, healthy body. That's actually kind of a good thing to have. It's not trauma. So it wasn't that she was sweating it out. It wasn't that she was shaking. And certainly we know about, there's even a discipline called TRE, which is called trauma release exercises. And I believe that's from David Balducci or Baldari or something. It's been a while since I've engaged with his stuff, but there is a practice called trauma release exercise. And that's a physical practice where people will lay on their back with their knees open, their hips open, and they will induce, by a couple of different practices they do for 5 minutes beforehand, like a wall sit, to really like exhaust the muscles in your legs, and then to keep your legs open and start actively shaking them. And that shaking response is similar to Peter Levine's work on the Awaken the Tiger Within. Does anybody know that book, Awaken the Tiger Within? If you do know that, could you write the guy's name? Levine, Levine, Levine. Write that in the chat. So people, if they want to go look into this guy, Waking the Tiger Within, that they can find him from his last name. But yeah, Peter Levine wrote a book that studied on his studies on how do animals in the wild deal with a traumatic event. And he noticed that they would fall down, they would become paralyzed, they'd go into almost a coma, and as they were waking up from this mauling or some kind of a tragic event, that the animals would start to shake. Their bodies would start to kick and shake, and that their legs would start kicking in air, and that it seemed like these animals were releasing some kind of a trauma in their body. So that's where the TRE human implementation came from, which is your psoas muscles in your legs are partially what does that. Your psoas muscles are partially what tend to, if we could say, store physiological trauma in the body. That is the conception that is used to say that the shaking is the releasing of energy. However, I would also ask you to consider this. Who here exercises? Who here does physical exercise, like at a gym, or do you lift weights or whatever? Okay. So when you lift weights, what you're essentially doing is you're not releasing energy from your muscles. If anything, you're putting energy into your muscles by exercising. So for instance, I've had some days where I've been like, oh my God, I am so tired. I do not have the energy to exercise, but I will make myself go. I have a gym at home that I built. I will go into my back patio and I will just start lifting some weights just like this. And I'll start pushing the weights up just like this. 25 pounds, whatever. 35 pounds, whatever I feel like picking up. Maybe it's some shoulder lifts like this, like that kind of thing. And I'll just start doing some very simple things with no commitment to do a full session. And you know what tends to happen is that I get a lot more energy from that. Something about exercise gives my muscles more energy. It's very interesting. Has anybody noticed that? Let me know in the chat. One, if you get energy from exercise. So if lifting weights gives your muscles energy, then what is going on when you're doing the psoas release or the psoas exercise? You're shaking muscles, but muscles don't release energy in that way. If anything, they get warm. But what you're really doing is you're storing energy in muscles. So these kinds of concepts, if we just like do these kind of parallels here, we can start to see that maybe the picture isn't so simple. Charlene, cool, nice. So you follow. So when we physically exert effort through muscles, those muscles don't release energy. Sure, the muscles can get sore a little bit, but overall, your whole body, you can actually get more energy by exercising. So if the TRE process is about repeatedly moving your psoas muscle, then how could you say that it's releasing energy? It may feel like some kind of a release, but that's the thing. We're still in this trap of, it's still a semantic trap. It's a word trap by saying that you release trauma. It's just like saying, are you going to buy the blue car or the red car? It's assuming that I even want the car. And it's assuming that trauma is something that you either release or you don't release. Do you see that? It's a framing of one or the other. Maybe you don't release trauma. Maybe you do. But is trauma the type of thing that you can release? Like, I don't know, can you hold the hair of a unicorn in your hand? I don't know. Maybe. But does a unicorn exist? Either you're going to get the unicorn's hair or you're not, right? It's just this framing there's so much that's assumed by the trauma that it can be released. When it's that there was an event that is a traumatic experience that happened, but how does that transmute into a physical or some kind of an energy that gets stored in your body? See, that's the kind of the thing that is a question. Now, when I asked that last week, I got a lot of different answers. I got a lot of good answers. Certainly a lot of the answers sounded really good. What some people told me is they like to yell, they like to scream, they like to shake their body, they like to get a massage, they have a trigger point release exercise they noticed really helped with releasing trauma in that kind of context. All my question was, can someone please just describe what releasing trauma is? What is the release thing? And so I got lots of different answers. One guy said, again, well, you clean out your lymph and your lymph stores the neurotransmitters of trauma. And I said, wow, well, that's a pretty substantial scientific claim that if you can measure the chemicals, which we can now measure all of the chemicals that are coming out of the skin through sweat or through the lymphatic glands in your body. I said, well, clearly you know a lot about this. Can you point to a scientific paper that has identified the molecule of trauma? What is that molecule of trauma? And we know it's not cortisol, and we know it's not adrenaline, because those are not trauma. Those are hormones and neurotransmitters that activate certain types of neurological functions that are important. You wouldn't survive if you released all of those. You can't survive without cortisol and adrenaline. So clearly not something that you're releasing. And also, if you're shaking your body, you're producing more of that than anything. Maybe having less of it maybe producing less cortisol and less adrenaline can be something that can help you in the process. But that's probably like more of creating a different hormone like testosterone. Did you know that if your body produces more testosterone, that your levels of cortisol can drop significantly? So is it that you're releasing trauma, or you're just creating a different ratio of hormones in your body? That could just as easily be true. So what if we could say that rather than, because again, what happens to your thinking when you have a lot of testosterone? You get really, let's say, goal oriented. You get really determined. You become very passionate. You get a lot of energy, and you move. You go forward, forward, forward. You don't spend time thinking about things in the past. And that's measurable by how much testosterone gets put in your body. So maybe then we would say that the therapy for treating a traumatic experience would be just give this person testosterone. Pump this guy full of testosterone, if that really was the fix, which it does seem to be correlated. And at least we have something tangible there that we could say, well, we can test that. We can certainly test it. Get a bunch of patients who have a lot of trauma and give them some testosterone. Give them TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. Why not? And if you think that's difficult, then I would point you to modern gender reassignment science, whatever that is today. If you're a 13-year-old girl and you feel like you're a boy in a woman's body, they'll give you testosterone, pretty much no questions asked. So those experiments are probably already taking place. And maybe that's why so many kids that are traumatized are now asking for hormone replacement therapy rather than talk therapy. Maybe there's something to that. I don't know. There certainly could be. We'll find out. I mean, certainly we're going to find a lot out about what does pumping a child full of different hormones do to them. Does it de-traumatize them? Does it extra traumatize them? Does it do nothing on that level? I would assume it's going to have something to do on that level, for sure. But I can't predict which one. So yeah, I think there's a deep question that needs to be asked is there a thread that connects a traumatic event and then what is left over in your body? There's a traumatic event. It flashes in your eyes. You have a memory of it, and you have a simple memory in your neurology and your body. Your body can also store memory. So you have a memory in your brain. Hopefully it's mapped to your body. If you have a vagus nerve issue, you disconnect between the memory in your brain and your body. So you can think you're cognitively cleared. You forget the trauma, but the trauma can still be in your body. And reconnecting from your brain to your body can allow you to remember the trauma, and then you release it. Now I want you to think of this word, release. So if we just type out release trauma, it looks like that. But what if I were going to say release your trauma? Read that carefully. If we're talking about a space in your brain, a space in your body that's occupied by a traumatic experience, and we want to shift what is on that spot, we would release the land where that trauma is to something that's of a higher energy, a higher purpose, a reinterpretation of that past trauma that is more empowering for you, because that is the name of the game. There's no releasing in the traditional sense, but there's a releasing of the land where that trauma has made its space. Maybe we should gentrify traumatic spaces in your brain, right? Move in different things into that spot. Release the land where the trauma is. Bring something in there that's bigger and better. Make there be no space for traumatic stuff to hold you down any longer. That's the concept. And I can certainly tell you that when people become so narrowly focused on trauma, they start to see trauma even potentially where it does not exist, or they see exacerbations, huge over examples of some small slight, something small that they can transform into a massive trauma because they might get something out of this whole trauma thing in their life. There can be some psychological benefits to seeing lots of trauma, and we know people do things called trauma bonding. So there's a lot of things that people do with trauma that can serve them in a way. So by teaching people like, oh, you have so much trauma in your body and that's why you're so sick and we need to release the trauma and all this kind of stuff, of course there's going to be a litany of people who will tell you that was what fixed me. No, Sterling, you don't understand. I went to a therapist and she moved her hands over my body and she pulled the trauma out of my body and I was no longer traumatized. And I'm like, okay, I'm a relatively well-mannered person, and it's really hard for me to look someone in the eyes who says something like that and just to say that you're wrong. So I wouldn't even say that. I wouldn't even get in their face or argue with them at all. I'd say, that's awesome. I'm so happy for you. And that's great. I'm really glad that experience allowed you to move forward in your life. That's fantastic. Like, I love that. I'm so happy for you. And then in another context, another environment, would still then as well kind of try to question, like, what really did happen in that situation? What really did happen? I want to understand what really is going on, because if we continue to push back on the questioning of, are you releasing trauma? Is trauma something that can be released? Are you trying to sell? You're thinking past the sale here. Remember, that's an important framing to take here, is the idea of, in human persuasion, if you want someone to assume that they're already going to buy something, you attach a verb to the noun. You want to say, are you going to fly your kite? Are you going to drive your car? Are you going to drive your car to Los Angeles or to San Francisco? That's assuming that the car purchase is already going to happen and that the car can be driven. But trauma is not a concrete thing, especially when we're talking about it being in your body. It's a memory. It's a storage of something. It's occupying some part of your brain and your neurology. There's trauma in your body and there's trauma in your brain. But what do you do with it? Is it an engram potentially? Is it a memory that's locked in some part of your brain? And the whole goal is to be in a state where you're resourced enough to re-experience it so that you can unlock it and encode something in its place that transforms that into something more empowering. That could be the secret. And I would rather someone be really good at that skill that I just described than releasing trauma, because there could be no end to the amount of trauma that you could find to release. And I've certainly done quite a lot of reading online. And I'll tell you, one story in particular was a young woman was convinced 100% that her whole objective for the next 18 months in her life would be to use psychedelics to help her deeply release all trauma in her body. This became her goal. This became her project of a lifetime, was to first, because she didn't feel she wasn't getting the kind of life that she wanted. She was still dating these probably bad guys in her life, making a lot of the same pattern mistakes, hanging out with the same old friends, doing the same kinds of things. She decided, I'm going to commit in the next 18 months to release my trauma, and I'm going to use, and this is what she said, I'm going to use plant medicine to help me, which in that case meant LSD and magic mushrooms and maybe some DMT smoking. Because those things can, we've all been told, deeply transformative, right? Cut to 18 months later, the girl is completely hooked on these psychedelic drugs. She's nowhere better than when she started. If not, she probably became way more traumatized by the experiences under psychedelics than any release that was able to happen. No release happened. She just crammed more trauma on top of trauma. And so, again, she was self-experimenting. obviously not working with anybody that knew what they were doing. She was just basically taking drugs and hoping that the trauma would, if I have enough hope that this will happen, then it'll happen. So, it's a cautionary tale, really. We have to be very careful because, again, by assuming this whole thing that you can release trauma, you are thinking past the sale. You're essentially saying to a person, do you want to buy the blue car or the red car? Assuming that you already want the car. This assumes that trauma is something that can be released, but we don't know that. We absolutely do not know that. There's no evidence of any release happening. Like the best attempt at an answer, and I got 50, 60 people responding to my question just last week on my own private personal page. I've got 5,000 people who read me on Facebook here, and lots of comments. Is it's a very big issue for people. Some of the best attempts were it's electrostatic energy that latches onto your body, and when you release trauma, you're letting go of electrostatic discharge, and that's it. I'm like, well, you can measure that. That's a measurable claim. And it's not like we're just learning about trauma. Trauma is something that like Freud talked about and Carl Jung talked about. And static electricity is a very well-known phenomenon. So if that were the case, I should clearly be able to measure overall average static electricity charge around a human. I've worked with electronics. You can measure somebody you measure a capacitor. How much storage of electrons do they have in their body? You can measure that kind of stuff. And then you do a trauma release exercise, and they're 50,000 electrons less. Is that, again, if it's static discharge, that's a measurable effect. So I can't claim that makes a lot of sense. Although a lot of these people that are saying this, I know them well, and I care about them as people. I also care about what's maybe true, I guess, which I can certainly understand makes me sound like a total asshole if I'm asking questions like this. But again, it's like, I think that there's risk for some substantial harm by letting people continue to frame trauma in the release type of way without actually questioning what is actually happening. Where could we have one sane, sober, rational person in the crowd saying, "Hey, what if you could live that extraordinary life that you wanted to, and you didn't have to spend a lot of time diving into traumatic experiences to release them? What if you could do things that built something beautiful and powerful and made it so that your trauma had no other choice but to get the heck out of your body? What if the trauma could just leave quietly from the back door without you even having to yell at it and kick and scream? Because isn't that like why a lot of these traumas happen? Is that there was a kick up, a storm, a frustration, a fight, a duel, a domestic assault situation at home with yelling and screaming and get the hell out of the house. So by treating this trauma in the same way that it entered into our brain, in a sense, we're just trying to relive the pattern of that. Now you're not even fixing something that happened between your parents. You're having an argument with an avatar hologram fractal of something that happened to you when you were a kid, that you need to release the trauma through some, sweaty, miserable, shamanic experience. It could be the mind trying to find another way to relive the trauma once more. And again, releasing trauma does not guarantee that you won't be triggered by that same thing in the future. So I see that all the time. I see people do tons of therapy, tons of crying therapy, talking about their trauma. And then they go in next week and they're just as traumatized as they were before. But they'll tell you up and down, oh, that was the best session ever. I think we really got somewhere deep. We talked really about my trauma and my childhood, and I feel like I got so much further. And then the next week they're really right back at the same therapist. They're doing the exact same thing. So when you have results like that, I mean, how could you even question this whole field of trauma release when certainly if it were such a scientific exercise, we wouldn't have so many open-ended questions about what is trauma actually in the body, what is being released, why do people have to, and can you release it? Why do people have to go back to trauma therapy again and again and again and again and again and don't seem to make any progress? Whereas you see people go to, let's take, for example, a seminar on personal success and standing your ground, making your claim, breaking old beliefs, setting new thoughts and habits and desires in your brain. And you see the people go to seminars like that, and it's a 3-day, 4-day ordeal, and then they're out just crushing it. So, and they don't talk about releasing trauma at those types of events. At a 4-day mass seminar, like a Tony Robbins seminar, they're not talking about releasing your trauma. They're talking about, release, like taking energy, pulling it out, throwing it into the fire. They're talking about breaking beliefs that you hold in your mind, beliefs that you might have created under a traumatic experience. They're really not doing that kind of stuff. And then I guess they are witnessing, like people do share, like, yeah, they say I was assaulted when I was a kid, and they get to say that in front of a bunch of people. And certainly there can be something cathartic about that. But again, I don't think any of that points to, well, haha, that proves that everybody releases their trauma. I don't know if everybody releases their trauma. Like I said, I think what you could also look at it is, and you could say both are true, both could be true, is that also the key other aspect that's not spoken about too much and is almost like shunned is create a neural pathway in your brain for gratitude. Make the gratitude really, really strong and be ready to, like a landscaper is to destroy anything in its path that doesn't serve your gratitude muscle. And so be it with it. Whatever sparks fly from you building a strong gratitude muscle to see how everything's happening for you and not to you, to see a deeper, grander vision and purpose for your life that included the good and the bad, that it all happened for you to grow into a beautiful, amazing force for good in the world. And anything that stands in the way, it's gonna fight back, but you don't let it stop you. And you just keep on charging forward and you build the life that you always wanted. And you don't focus on the nasty stuff too much. You just keep on going forward and building. Build the positive stuff. I could technically say that that's still going to get you very far down the line. And not once in that do you have to reflect on, some deeply traumatic experiences, other than maybe to transmute it into a story to tell other people so they can realize that you are like them, that you too had to go through some similar stuff, and that if they could do it, I could do it. That's almost the only release of trauma is when it is released from your lips and you're telling another person about it, not when you're shaking and stuff like that. So anyway, but to put a capper on this, all of that is still not possible if your vagus nerve is completely shot. So be what it will. I believe that if you did focus on your vagus nerve first, that you might find that a lot of the things you think are traumatic experiences are actually beautiful gifts waiting for you to unlock and to transmute into something amazing. Like Christina Helgevold, who is a client from Norway, who is exactly who I was talking about earlier. You can do something just like that. And that was 3 weeks of stimulating her vagus nerve. Her gastroparesis, her depression, all of the really bad, weird symptoms that the doctors couldn't figure out were relieved from that one session where she stimulated her vagus nerve, and she had a cathartic experience, and she was overwhelmed with joy. If you look at what she wrote after that, she was writing things like, "Oh, Captain, my captain, Sterling, the captain of the vagus nerve, thank you so much for giving me my life back. I have so much more hope. I have so much more joy. I have so much more passion for my life. I feel like my life is possible to live again. Do you see what's going on there? It's not that she released trauma and just had this neutral affect. It was that she crushed that stuff in the background. Moving your legs and your psoas is more like you're crushing cans in between your thighs. That's what it is. TRE is about crushing the cans of trauma and throwing them in the recycling bin so you can create a house out of aluminum. That's the whole process. I think that's much more accurate and my observation than any kind of like release of trauma. So again, and that just comes from someone who literally does this kind of stuff all the time. These are real people. These are real accounts. This is the real deal. So if you do believe you have some trauma, which I think everybody could believe it if they wanted to, is to experiment with stimulating your vagus nerve before diving in. You can still go down that road. But just know that if your vagus nerve is impaired, if it's pinched, if it's malnourished, if it just has generalized lack of stimulation, which we talked about yesterday, GLOS is general lack of stimulation. GLOS, if you have GLOS, then your vagus nerve isn't even functioning and firing at all. You could have the most perfect neck. You could be eating all the food in the planet, but if you don't do anything to stimulate your vagus nerve, it will atrophy too. Just like if somebody wears a cast on their body, on their arm, and they take it off 6 months later, do the arms look the same? No. The left arm that's been in the cast is like skin and bones. That's it. So that's general lack of muscle stimulation. And the vagus nerve can succumb to the exact same factors and forces, just like that. So there are lots of things that can be done. We'll certainly continue to talk about that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up for YouTube. Thanks, YouTube, for checking us out. Make sure you like and subscribe. I hope we get to come back to this conversation in the future. Thanks so much, YouTube. And we're going to go back to just the Facebook group. Here we go. All right, cool.